A while back, I got a comment on a video asking, so are you like in love with Kyle? This is of course referring to Kyle Kulinski, host of the show Secular Talk. And I get it, I do talk about him an awful lot. I think I talk about TYT slightly more, but point taken all the same. To answer the question, no, I am not in love with Kyle. Nor for that matter do I hate him. But I do criticize him quite a bit on this channel, and there's a reason for that. I think he's the epitome of something you come across a lot here on YouTube and on the internet generally. Kyle is someone with an overly simplistic worldview. I'm not saying he's stupid. In fact, I think Kyle is a pretty smart guy. I just think he fails to examine the nuances and complexities of the things he talks about. I've said before that he only has about 6 different arguments, and he just cycles through those from topic to topic. Kyle himself has even admitted that his show can be quite repetitive.
Again, I hate to keep bringing these points up, but you have to. People accuse the show of being repetitive. Guilty. Because the issues are the same. They haven't changed.
Again, this isn't necessarily an insult. In fact, it's part of why he's as popular and persuasive as he is. Repetition is a highly effective rhetorical device. I liken Kyle to the Christian theologian William Lane Craig. If you ever watch Dr. Craig debate, he mostly just repeats his central arguments, regardless of who his opponent is or what that person is saying. It's one of the reasons why he's so successful at debates. He has his shtick, and he has it down. So too with Kyle. But being a good debater and a persuasive rhetorician is not the same thing as being a genuine expert. I believe that if you examine his arguments critically, you'll find there's a superficiality to them. Kyle likes to give you a few facts, and then he fills in the rest with indignation. Even when he's completely wrong or obviously ignorant, he'll speak with confidence all the same. I'm not the first one to have noticed this.
People say that I'm not humble or whatever, that I'm arrogant or whatever. I'm incredibly humble in my online discourse. If you come on and you tell me a bold-faced lie, and I don't know enough about it to know that you're wrong, I'll usually just give you the point. That's why I let Kyle Kulinski walk all over me with this absolutely stupid NAFTA arguments. Even though I was pretty sure I was right, he was so confident in the dumb he was saying, I let him have it. It's like, okay, sure, I'll go back and I'll research it or whatever.
Luckily enough, international trade happens to be one of the subjects I actually do know well. And I can say that Kyle's debate with Destiny isn't a one-off. Pretty much every video he does on this topic, he demonstrates that he doesn't know a whole lot about what is admittedly a pretty complicated subject. For example, let's look at the way he talked about Hillary Clinton's record on international trade.
It's the fact that she supported NAFTA and GATT and the World Trade Organization and all these outsourcing deals.
Kyle obviously does not approve of the alphabet soup that is our current international trade regime. But did he represent Hillary Clinton's position correctly? Well, she did at one point support the TPP, and I have heard her say good things about NAFTA, which her husband did pass. But what about GATT? Some of you may not have heard of that one. GATT stands for the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Do you know when GATT was ratified? October 30th, 1947, when Hillary Clinton was 4 days old. I seriously doubt that she had very sophisticated views on the treaty at that point. It's also worth noting that we constructed that agreement because trade wars had been so economically damaging during the Great Depression, and that they had raised hostilities between nations like Japan and the United States prior to the war. Now, maybe Kyle was just making a flub there. He does mostly speak off the cuff on his show, so things like that can certainly happen. But I do believe that this is demonstrative of his ignorance on the subject. I'm not going to talk about what Kyle gets wrong on trade, though. I've done that before, and I will probably do it again. No, today I want to talk about his populism. If there's one thing that's definitely true about Kyle, it's that he's heavily invested in public opinion. I've never heard someone invoke polls more than him.
The stuff we push for on the left, all of the polling shows that it's overwhelmingly popular. You know what the polls say? The polls show that we have the more popular positions. When you look at the polling data, going by the polling data, it polls over 50%. I've already seen polls. Go to any poll on the actual issues.
And it's true. If you ask people what they think about progressive policies in the abstract, usually a majority of people will respond positively. Unfortunately for Kyle and anyone else who invokes polling, most people don't take issues into consideration when they enter the voting booth. The overwhelming conclusion of the book, Democracy for Realists, written by Christopher H. Aiken and Larry M. Bartels, is that people don't vote based on issues. Voters, even the most informed voters, typically make choices not on the basis of policy preferences or ideology, but on the basis of who they are, their social identities. People who fail to acknowledge this, especially people who are heavily invested in the outcomes of elections, will continue to be frustrated by the political system not working in the way they think it should. And their frustration breeds a certain kind of grievance politics. This is actually something that right-wing, nationalist, populist, make America great again types have in common with their counterparts on the left. They both think that they're popular, they both think that they're in the majority, hence they both believe that they should be winning all the time. And when they don't, they think that they've been cheated. Kyle has gone so far as to say that it's a fluke when progressives don't win.
She's right that numerically there's not that many of you, but you got the people power. Because this small group of lefties represents the silent majority of Americans. Well, it's time to make that silent majority not so silent anymore.
Just looking at the federal government, how many politicians are true progressives according to Kyle? Well, there's Bernie Sanders, obviously. There's also Elizabeth Warren, though she's fallen out of favor with a lot of Bernie supporters as of late. Then there are maybe a few others. In the House, there's the Squad, of course. Then there are a handful of progressives that our friends on the left really love. So at best, there are what, 24 politicians out of 535 who are sufficiently progressive? I haven't even mentioned all the governors and local politicians who I assume don't fit the bill. Given all of this, the idea that it's a fluke when non-progressives win is false by definition. If the progressive agenda was the winning agenda, then progressives would win a lot more. So, how does someone maintain that the country is progressive, yet simultaneously explain away the lack of results? Well, they accuse their opponents of cheating, or creating an unfair system. When he says this,
all things being equal, if all things were equal, and it was actually a battle of competing philosophies and ideas, the left would be running roughshod over the corporatists.
He means that progressives would win if they only had a level playing field. In practice, what this actually means is that if a progressive doesn't win, Kyle will work his way backwards to find an excuse for why the progressive was cheated. Let's look at when Justice Democrats, the organization Kyle co-founded, primaried the moderate Democratic senator from West Virginia, Joe Manchin, with the populist progressive Paul Eugene Swearengin. Now, Kyle assured us that despite electing Joe Manchin to statewide office 6 times, the people of West Virginia actually wanted a true progressive representing them in the Senate.
The people aren't stupid. It's not like the people wake up in West Virginia and they go, you know, here we love corporatism and we love sellouts. And Joe Manchin is exactly that, but we'll support him over somebody who really wants to fight for the people. They don't think that. How condescending of corporate Democrats and of the establishment to look down their nose at the people and go, no, they love sellouts in West Virginia. They don't. They haven't been given the option of the populist left. Now we're giving them the option.
I would say that it's condescending to suggest that the people who voted for Joe Manchin, who is the most popular politician in the history of West Virginia since they've been polling that question, didn't actually want him in the first place. I would say that it's condescending to suggest that the people who keep voting him into office don't actually feel represented by him. I think it's condescending to suggest that the whole time they've just been fooled by the coal lobby into electing their preferred candidate. But hey, that's just me. I guess some people might not know what they want until they've been offered it. So how did the Justice Democrats fare in this election? Not so well. Manchin won nearly 70% of the vote to Swearengin's 30%. So yeah. Now, how did Kyle explain away this loss? He gave the typical litany of excuses.
When the media is not covering you, when you're an outsider with no name recognition, and when you can only raise $180,000 and corporate Joe Manchin, and that's exactly what he is, make no mistake about it, corporate Joe Manchin raises $6 million, well, that's a f***ing problem.
It's worth noting that these explanations seem to only work one way. When a progressive wins, it's because they're a progressive. But when a non-progressive wins, that's when we get these lame explanations. For example, Kyle loves to bring up the fact that Sherrod Brown, a left-wing Democratic senator, won in Ohio, whereas the moderate Joe Donnelly lost his race in neighboring Indiana in the same year.
As a general rule, the further left you were, the better you did. I mean, look at Sherrod Brown, who ran a pretty unapologetically left-wing campaign in Ohio, won as a Democratic senator. And then you have, in Indiana, what's his name? I see his face in my head, but I'm blanking on his name right now. Joe Donnelly. Joe Donnelly ran basically saying, I'm a right-winger. He was praising Reagan in his ads as a Democratic senator. Praising Reagan, saying, I like the idea of the wall, on Medicare for all, and he lost.
What he doesn't mention for some reason is that Sherrod Brown was an incumbent, got more media coverage, and outspent his opponent by more than 5-1. Apparently, those things only matter when a progressive loses. It's also worth noting that these explanations for elections are mutually exclusive with the idea that the progressive agenda is the winning agenda. If people vote based on incumbency, then they're not voting because of progressive credentials. If people vote based on name recognition, then they're not voting based on progressive credentials. If people are voting for the candidate who spent the most money, then they're not voting because of progressive credentials. At what point can we say that people generally don't vote based on progressive credentials? Again, if the progressive agenda was the winning agenda, then progressives would win a lot more often. But remember, Kyle thinks that Congress should look like an inversion of what it is right now, where rather than being a small minority, progressives should hold the vast majority of seats. If it's true that what people really want are politicians that implement left-wing policies, then that means voters are consistently getting fooled into voting against their preferences significantly more often than they're not. And this is the key point I want to make in this video. Why is it that a guy who is so invested in public opinion, who consistently talks about opinion polls, who is always railing on and on about how we need to fulfill the will of the people, thinks that the electorate is so easily fooled. How is it that someone can be so confident in populism, yet have so little faith in the electorate to identify which candidates hold progressive views they supposedly want? This is a big reason why I'm not a populist. I don't have that much faith in mass democracy. It's funny because as much as I criticize Kyle, we do have something in common. We're both atheists. I don't think we have the exact same views on religion, but I actually do like a lot of the videos he makes on the subject, and I generally agree with him. Here's the thing though. We are both well outside of public opinion on this very important question. Obviously, it depends on the poll you look at and the way the question is asked, but only about 10% of Americans don't believe in God or a higher power or anything supernatural. Meanwhile, 80% of Americans say they believe in a personal God, including 56% of the country which believes in the God of the Bible. These numbers are from the Pew Research Center, by the way. According to most of the polls I looked at, most Americans also think that the decline of religion in the US is a bad thing. There is no content to atheism, of course. There are no politics, no doctrine, nor any dogma inherent to atheism. Being an atheist doesn't even determine whether or not you view religion favorably. But being an atheist in religious America should teach you one thing. The majority of people can be wrong about something very important. Given that's the case, I honestly don't get how a dude who hosts a show named Secular Talk can have so much faith in popular opinion, because it's not just matters of religion that Americans get wrong. Since Joe Biden is ahead of Bernie Sanders in almost all Democratic primary polls, the former vice president is under scrutiny from our friends on the left. One of the criticisms they have stuck with is pointing out that Joe Biden supported the crime bill, which they deem to be racist in theory and implementation.
Whenever it was politically convenient, Joe Biden went hard right-wing, hard right-wing.
Now, I'm not here to defend or criticize the '94 crime bill. That's beyond the scope of this video. But I do want to point out that the bill's latter-day critics seem to be forgetting the context in which that bill was passed. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, crime was really high, especially in America's cities. Lots of people were calling for government action. In fact, when the crime bill was passed, it was pretty popular, especially among African Americans, the people who were supposedly the most negatively affected by the legislation. According to the New York Times, 58% of non-whites approved of the bill in '94, as compared to 49% of whites. When the bill passed, more Americans listed crime as the most important problem in the country than ever before, or since. The bill was backed by a group of 10 black mayors of large, majority black American cities. What about the other thing the progressives slammed Biden for? His vote for the Iraq War. Well, according to the Pew Research Center, in March of 2003, when Congress voted on approval for the authorization, 73% of Americans thought it was a good idea. Now, why is Kyle mad at Joe Biden for voting for these things? Isn't he always going on and on about how politicians should do their job and implement the will of the people? The will of the people being what is reflected in poll numbers? Why is it that Bernie Sanders is a prescient hero for voting against these things when they are popular, but politicians like John Delaney, who go against the grain by supporting unpopular things like the TPP, are labeled as corporatists?
John Delaney, Barack Obama, and all the Republicans who supported TPP, and the corporate Democrats, they don't care about fair trade because they are very sympathetic to the corporations.
Again, I'm not making value judgments on the crime bill, the Iraq War, or any other piece of legislation here. But for the sake of argument, let's just say that both were unmitigated disasters. Doesn't that show that the electorate cannot be trusted to consistently make the best decisions? A lot of people who are critical of the Iraq War blame the media for helping to push public opinion in a supportive direction. Let's say they're right. Doesn't that show how malleable and easily manipulated the electoral consensus is? This isn't really a problem for me though, because I don't view public opinion as a sanctifying principle. I'm a skeptic of democracy, not an enthusiast. Kyle, however, has to reconcile these things. He's the one who never shuts up about opinion polls.
You're the polls guy! You're the polls guy, dude!